welcome to Red Ice Creations Radio. My name is Henrik. If you are a regular listener, you know what we're doing here. If you're new to the program, check out our website, redicecreations.com, R-E-D-I-C-E, creations.com, and that will give you all the details on what we're doing here. Today we have with us on the line someone who I've wanted to speak to for a long time. We have alternative, I guess you can say, Egyptologist John Anthony West with us. He is behind the DVD series Magical Egypt, and he's written extensively on the subject. To name a few of his titles, Serpent in the Sky, The High Wisdom of Ancient Egypt, The Traveler's Key to Ancient Egypt, and The Mystery of the Sphinx. His website that you definitely should take a look at is jawest.net. That's for John Anthony West. So go there and take a good look around. There's loads of material up there for you. So with that, welcome to the program, John Anthony West. Thank you very much for coming on.
Well, thank you, Henrik, and thank you for inviting me.
It's excellent. I'm really looking forward to this. There's so much to talk about, but I do want to kind of run over a little bit of the background, if you will, for our listeners that potentially haven't heard about you or your work before. So if you will, tell us a little bit how you kind of got involved and how your interest got, how you got started looking at Egypt, as it were.
Okay, how my interest actually got distracted into Egypt is more like it.
Right.
But it's a long story, which would sometimes occupy a couple of hours on a bus in Egypt, but I won't go into a couple of hours worth. Just briefly, at a very early age, 13 or so, I realized I'd been born into a lunatic asylum, and it was a fairly shattering understanding, since practically nobody shared it at that time. Now, with the whole world melting down, right on schedule, I might add, just about everybody knows that the whole thing is insane. But I knew this way back when, age 13, that's 1945. And by the time I was 19, I knew what I wanted to do. I wanted to be the little boy who said the emperor has no clothes. And I started out in that direction, but with no thought of scholarship. Basically, I was writing satirical, creative work, a novel, book of short stories, number of plays, some screenplays that didn't get done, but that got written. And at a certain point, actually, on my website, there's a story called a short story called "The Emperor's New Clothes Continued," picking up the story where Hans Christian Andersen left off. And what happens in my story is that when the little child says the emperor has no clothes in the story, because it's a fairy tale, everyone says, "Oh, the emperor has no clothes." But in real life, what happens is that the empire regroups and eventually proves that it's the little child who's imaginary and the emperor's new clothes are real.
Right. That's a
funny
good one.
Story
that
got published in the now defunct Omni magazine. Anyway, so I was living, when my first short story was published, which is back in 57, I was working in Madison Avenue in advertising as a copywriter. And all of a sudden there was my first short story accepted, and I said, the hell with this, I'm not a copywriter, I'm a real writer. And off I went to, and then, again, a long story how I got there, to the wild island of Ibiza, which was hippie haven back through the late 50s. Well, that's pre-hippie days. I antedate the hippies. and it was a wild place, and a lot of people, mostly getting stoned and drunk, and a few of us getting some work done while getting stoned and drunk, I might add.
Right.
And anyway, through a strange set of circumstances, I got interested in these subjects. First in astrology, through a good friend of mine who was a Dutch novelist, a very accomplished Dutch novelist. And then that led me, by a series of strange steps, to the Gurdjieff work. And that was and continues to be my home. But through the Gurdjieff work, at a certain point, I realized that to do the discipline, in other words, just thinking about stuff doesn't serve any purpose. You have to actually do it. It's like, a path is something that you walk on. It's like playing a sport or playing the violin. You can listen to it from now till doomsday, but until you actually do it, you're not doing it. So anyway, I wanted to get into one of the schools that followed Gurdjieff's teachings, and that involved getting me to taking me from Ibiza, where I'd already spent 9 years, to England. And there in my Gurdjieff group, through another strange series of circumstances, I got a contract to write a book on astrology. I called The Case for Astrology, now out of print. But I was convinced that through by now, a lot of study, that astrology was not a Chaldean, Babylonian superstition rationalized by the Greeks, but that it went back much earlier. And this was this basically was the same thing that Gurdjieff would be talking about on his take it or leave it basis. I mean, he's an extraordinary man, Mr. Gurdjieff was.
Yes.
And all of a sudden, here was this contract to write a book called The Case for Astrology, which is not a how-to book. It doesn't tell you what a good day to buy a poodle is or invest in a stock. Well, nowadays, no day is a good day to invest in a stock.
That's right.
But through somebody in the group, I was working on the history of astrology, trying to plumb back to demonstrate that it was much, much older. And somebody introduced me to the work of R.A. Schwaller de Lubitsch, the French genius with the unpronounceable name.
Yes.
And his books at that time were not yet translated out of French, and my French was pretty rudimentary, but nevertheless I attacked it, and for about 10 months, went every day across London to the British Museum, fighting my way through the impenetrable Schwaller with a dictionary by my side, and that ended up as a long chapter in the initial publication of The Case for Astrology. And once I got hold of Schwaller, I realized initially I thought he must have been a Gurdjieff pupil. They were both in Paris at the same time, but he wasn't. There was no connection between the two men. But what Schwaller was doing on the scholarly level was effectively demonstrating everything that Gurdjieff was talking about. And one of the things I must say that appealed to me about Gurdjieff was that he was the first person I had ever encountered, although posthumously he died in 49, who was as contemptuous of all of Western civilization as I was. And the difference was that he knew how to live in it, and I didn't, not very well.
Right.
So that was really one of the main attractions. And anyway, there was Schwaller, and I realized almost upon opening the book that he had done something of inestimable value. He had demonstrated through absolutely impeccable scholarship that the old belief percolating down from Greece and through the Renaissance itself, the belief that ancient Egypt was the source and fount of all of Western wisdom, this was taken as a matter of trust actually right up to about the 19th century, when the Church of Progress took over from the decrepit and degenerate Church of Rome. And Schwaller had actually, he'd reformulated the sacred science of the Egyptians, of the ancients in general, because Egypt wasn't the only place that had this knowledge. The Chinese had it, and the Indians had it, the Mesoamericans had it. The difference with Egypt really is that there's so much of it left. I mean, you can actually go and immerse yourself in the sacred science of Egypt just by going there, whereas in all of these other civilizations, there's really very little left of them that you can experience. You can read about it. It's all there. The doctrine is all there. And the doctrines are all basically the same. I mean, they take it as a premise, as a given, that we human beings are not accidental glitches in an accidental universe, but that rather that we have a specific role to play, which is the acquisition of a level of consciousness that we are not born with, but that we have the potential to reach. And this is what in Egypt is called the doctrine of immortality, and what in other civilizations is called samadhi or nirvana or whatever. I mean, different names for it. But basically, it's the same doctrine that we're here for a reason, and if we don't pursue that path, we do so at our peril. And actually, it's very interesting where we are at the moment, because all of this this crash that's engulfing the entire world now, is a consequence of a fraudulent and debased materialistic philosophy. In any event, there was Schwaller, and I, in the first astrology book, I even though it didn't fit really, I put in a long chapter about Schwaller because, as I said, he hadn't been translated out of the French, and he was scarcely known in France either. And that chapter intrigued publishers, and they came to me and asked if I would do a book on Schwaller, and I said, you bet, because I regarded that as actually more to my liking and interest even than the astrology, which was partial. But the Egyptian doctrine was, you might say, a template of how a civilized society actually comports itself. So 6 years later, there came The Serpent in the Sky. And while doing the research for that, I came across a single line of Schwaller's about the Great Sphinx, that the Great Sphinx, Schwaller's line was, and of course the Great Sphinx of Giza shows unmistakable signs of water erosion. And that dropped the penny in the slot. Schwaller, that was in one of his ancillary books in English called Sacred Science, The King of the Pharaonic Theocracy. And he himself, I think, did not recognize the bombshell that he dropped. In any event, he died about a year later, because the notion that the Sphinx was weathered by water, I'm not a geologist, but I knew enough about Egyptian geology to know that the Sahara was a relatively new desert. It's been pretty much bone dry since about 4000 BC, and it formed about 10,000 BC. And I realized that if you could prove that the Sphinx was weathered by water, you would, in a single stroke, subvert all of ancient history as it's taught to us, which is that it starts off very primitive and it's all hunter-gatherers, and then at some point or another civilizations arise, and eventually we end up with our enlightened selves, with our hydrogen bombs and our bobblehead dolls and our Walmarts and our supermarkets. and I realized that if you could prove that the Sphinx, put it this way, for the Sphinx to be weathered by water, it means it has to have been built at a time when there was water in Egypt. And that takes us way back, without going into the details, but probably before 10,000 BC. So then you're confronted. Then you've got a big problem if you're an academic, or as I call them, a quackademic. It means that the most spectacular sculpture on Earth, and the Sphinx most assuredly is, was carved at a time when there's not supposed to be any civilization at all. And perhaps even more important in terms of our modern intellect, the temples right immediately in front and adjacent to it are not huge as Egyptian temples go, but they're built of blocks of stone fit into place like pieces in a jigsaw puzzle. That weigh anything from 50 to 150, even more tons each. So we couldn't do that today, actually. We've done, I don't know if you've seen The Mystery of the Sphinx. That was the big documentary that we did with Charlton Heston. The experts in these fields, the people who deal with lifting heavy blocks of whatever these days, have cranes big enough to maneuver blocks of stone that size, but they wouldn't, in fact, know how to rig them. So, in other words, we're confronted with something built when there's not supposed to be any civilization at all that we couldn't build today, and we don't know how they built it either. I mean, this is quite clear. We don't know how they did it. Quackademics insist that it was enough guys with ropes and levers, and that's how